Starting our meeting. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 22nd in a series of what we call Fourth Friday Talks. Today, Thursday, October 23rd, by the New York Main Street Alliance. And my name is Victor Dadras. I'm on the
Still
board.
waiting another minute for a few other people to come on, but
Yep.
we'll just wait one more minute.
Okay, we'll wait one more minute. And then I'll introduce our speaker, Mike Lydon. Mike is the principal of street
You can
plan.
go for it, Victor. Go for it.
Yeah, the street plans in New York City. I think he's well known as the author and developer of the tactical urbanism. Author of the book, co-author with Tony Anthony Garcia, and I think noted as one of the 100 most influential urbanists of all time. So that's pretty impressive. And you know what? I believe that. I think he is. He has changed the way we as urban designers, community planners, Main Street and downtown revitalization consultants, how we view the work we do. And we couldn't be happier to have him join this series. He's also been very generous about helping with his time and efforts, because I think, like all of us on this at this meeting and with the New York Main Street Alliance, we truly believe in the work we do and the effect it can have and the positive effects it can have on our communities. Elise just joined us. Good morning, Elise.
Morning.
So we have an outstanding presentation. It is in depth, and I'm going to ask Mike to start it. Mike's presentation will go about 40 minutes, and we want to leave about 20 minutes for discussion and question and answers. So without any further talking by myself, we can talk during the discussion area. I want to introduce our friend and colleague and thank him again for his joining us today, Mike Lydon.
Thank you, Victor, and good morning to everybody. I have two maladies today to share. One is a slight cold, and the other is a fly flew into my eye while cycling home the other day. It's developed into a little bit of an infection. So hopefully that's not too much of a distraction. Hopefully you can understand my voice. But I will just jump right in here. I'm an urban planner and designer. I've lived in Brooklyn now for 16 years, but I grew up in a very small town in the coast of Maine, and very classic Main Street that really informed everything I love about streets and public spaces and downtown environments. And so this is a town of 1,200 people, but if you look at that street, you look at the way it works, it's like any great urban street that in a much, much bigger city. So I feel like just underscoring that if you're in a small town or a big city, urbanism and walkability and that sort of dynamic environment can work at all scales, as you all know. In my work, I focus a lot on transforming streets and public spaces. For me, this started way back in the mid-2000s in Miami, and I got very involved with a number of initiatives there, but jumpstarting some cycling advocacy had its early form in an open street. So we started shutting down Flagler Street, which is the main street in downtown Miami, to cars every month. And that temporary initiative, for 6 hours every, Sunday, once a month, totally transformed the way that people thought about the street, the downtown, and what was possible. And that was really, really critical. And that's what really hooked me into this idea that the short term and the temporary can really inform lasting change, which is what you see in the upper right with those two images, one a rendering and one the ribbon cutting on making Flagler much more of a pedestrian street several years later. So that's the work that we do at Street Plans. We help communities envision and then deliver transformation in their streets and public spaces. So we get very much involved with conventional planning projects and processes, get into the more technical design and visuals to help people understand what transformation can be, and then we help them implement it at various sort of time scales, which I'll get into. So here's our main street in Manhattan. This is Broadway, obviously, in Soho, which I'm sure most of you know to some degree. We were hired, several years ago now during the pandemic to rethink how Broadway could work, and particularly thinking about economic recovery as it was really struggling during the depths of the pandemic. And of course, when I think about economic recovery, I think about we need more people, right? We need people back in these streets. And what would that look like? And so this was one of the visions we developed for the transformation of Broadway. And for those who are actively engaged in the process, this was a response, which is, not atypical, right? We're envisioning this lasting big change. And that's really what the challenges are when you're engaged in planning processes like that, is that you think long-term, expensive, inflexible, long delivery timelines. It's really hard with political continuity, public support, and just finding the resources to make long-term transformations like that happen. And because when they do, they often require so much time and effort, it typically attracts people with time and resources to participate over many, many years. And that can breed a lot of mistrust in the process. And so I love this quote from Jane Jacobs, that when we're only reliant on long-term strategies and long-term thinking, we wind up losing sort of the small scale, the iterative, the many hands that make places great, which in this quote, I think, is the tactic part, right? How do individuals and small groups of people and property owners and the whole ecosystem of a city, how do we all participate in making it a better place? So back to Soho, here's a great quote from Rick Cole, which I love, is, when you build our landscapes around places to go, we lose places to be. And I think our main streets, sure, have to facilitate places to go, but really they're about places to be. And so this is the transformation we came up with in response to all that negativity around the district in Soho and what we were trying to achieve long term, to just show them rather than tell them. Like, sure, a pretty picture is great, but results are greater than renderings, as I like to say. And we wanted to show that you could create a real destination on Prince Street and on Broadway very quickly, very inexpensively, which is what we did over the course of a month, activating Prince Street and making it car free. And of course, we measure and evaluate whether it's for a month or it's for a year or longer. We like to evaluate and share the results. I won't go through all these notes here due to time, but I would say that the biggest and common complaint we had, even from the stakeholders who were not, or I would say, scared about the big vision, is that they all complained that it's too loud. And so we were measuring the decibel levels along Broadway, which were on an average level above the levels that are considered safe for people to be repeatedly exposed to. And when we made this change over those 4 weekends, we were able to bring that decibel level down to a safe point. And I think that's a really sort of that quality of life, noise pollution, city living. When you can prove that out, it really actually started to bring more people over to our side. And then we started to survey not just this small elite group of people who are part of this, stakeholder group, but the actual residents, actual people using the street. We found overwhelming support for the kinds of transformations that we were piloting. So this gets to a great quote from Nicholas Bagley, a professor at University of Michigan, which is, we've really focused too much on process, not on outcomes. And so our work is entirely about getting to outcomes and being humble about that, knowing that we might not get everything right, which is why we work iteratively in temporary fashions so that we can better understand the kinds of transformations that are going to be welcome politically, that are going to functionally work, and that deliver on lasting visions, both in the short term and build up to that long-term change that I think all of us as professionals and advocates seek. So our definition is that tactical urbanism is an approach to community building or neighborhood building using short-term, low-cost, and scalable projects that from the beginning are intended to catalyze long-term change. You may not know how you're going to get to that point, but that's the goal, right? That's what you're starting off doing by trying something in the near term. And so what this does is it reorients people's thinking from the long-term and capital only, and sort of the despair and the frustration and the burnout that can kind of come with working towards those big visions. And it gives you different types of iterations to start to work with to inform and then eventually get to long-term investment. And so I explain this as, demonstration projects are primarily about community engagement. They're about getting quick and cheap ideas out there, getting public feedback, maybe allaying some fears, or even proving that some fears are actually born in reality, that you have to acknowledge that and find different types of solutions moving forward. So these projects are 1 day or 1 month. A pilot project is really about performance and testing and evaluating over the course of many months or a year plus. So you can kind of see the life cycle over, summer, winter, weather. How does the plowing work? Whatever. Like you can really see the performance and evaluate it honestly for what's working well and what isn't. And then interim design is using a very similar approach, but it's meant to be a bridge. It's a placeholder from a successful pilot or demonstration that can be still a bit flexible, but is durable enough to last for many years in the place of waiting for the resources and the construction of a long-term project. And so when we started all this, a decade plus ago, it was really experimental. It was what can we grab for a few $100s? What can we do in the middle of the street with cones, hay bales, flowers, whatever? Even using, we heard this rumor that if you put hairspray on spray chalk when you're creating markings on the street, that would help it last longer. We learned that it really doesn't. So, this is the kind of experimentation we were doing just to figure things out. But now the work is much more sophisticated. The materials are much more understood. The timelines are longer. The maintenance practices, the engagement techniques. We've really built sort of this ecosystem with so many partners
Hi, Alicia.
around the country on how to do this work, and many others are practicing it as well, which is really exciting to see. The movement has sort of evolved from those hay bales and more activist roots into cities, formally adopting and testing out this approach. New York City Department of Transportation is on the leading edge of this forever. Well, not forever, but for a very long time. They were experimenting with things, long before many other cities were. That really inspired a lot of the work that I was looking at in the late 2000s, both from the activist side and then from the city side. And then I'd say between 2015 and 2020, after our first book came out, we saw the sophistication grow, we saw the movement evolve, but it was really COVID that put tactical urbanism on overdrive around the globe. Cities obviously had to act quickly and be nimble and be responsive, and not all, but many of the initiatives that were started at that time, many of them have carried through towards moving towards permanence. So in summary, why is this methodology work? You don't have to call it tactical urbanism. Sometimes that turns people off, but really the principles of this are super important, and they're scalable to any context, which is, delivering public benefit at a lower upfront cost. It's temporary, allows for evaluation and adjustments. Obviously, it's action oriented, and you can bring in the public in a very different way. Rather than having them mark up maps, you're having them mark up streets. And at the end of the day, it's very people oriented. And so all of some of the earlier projects that we were involved with, such as this one all the way in Australia back in 2013. This is their main street in a small suburb called Penrith outside of Sydney. Went through a 4-year tactical phase with many iterations that then informed a capital investment. And so we're seeing now over 10, 15 years, some of those early projects, many of them have been made more permanent with the learnings and the support of people in the communities to make them lasting. So we've done this with partners, across New York, across New England, across the country, in small towns and small cities. We've done it in highly car-dependent suburban environments, and we've done it in very large cities. And I can tell you that it works almost better in a small-scale Main Street environment in a small town, because it's a lot easier just to get to yes and to get people on board quickly to experiment with our streets and our public spaces. And we've even worked with regional governments and national governments, as we did in New Zealand, on developing programs that can be scalable, that help bring this methodology to local communities at a much larger scale, to inform planning projects and lasting investments in streets and public spaces. So I'm going to go through 10 applications and how this can kind of work around main streets, and then I will share a couple of case studies if we have time. So this is sort of a classic way that we use tactical urbanism, which is really on the sort of the demonstration side of things, which is, hey, we have a planning process and we're going to be doing charrettes or workshops or meetings, maybe walking tours. Why don't we actually make a change and have that be part of the engagement process? Not only engage residents or stakeholders to deliver those changes, to go out in the streets with us and make those changes, but then to use them and give feedback. That is something that allows us for, in this instance in Nyack, New York, we were working with a firm called FHI Studio on developing a bike and ped plan for the community. And so during Earth Day, they have a big celebration and event. So that was a good time for us to go out and do what you see here on the screen to test out some of the infrastructure that we were contemplating already in the plan. You can engage communities after a planning process, right? So planning is great. We can build a lot of energy, get buy-in, get people to the table and align around a vision. But so often then that next step falters, or it takes a lot of time to see progress after the plan is complete. And so it's really important, we think, to be able to identify projects, programming, initiatives, things that you can do that go right from plan right into the pavement. And that's what you see here in a couple of examples. I'll speak about the one on the right, which is in the meatpacking district. I'll talk about that one a little bit later. We work a lot now with pilot projects to technically inform capital project development. So let's say a community gets a grant, and let's say it's for several $100,000 or several $1 million. They get to change their streetscape, which is not a very frequent opportunity, and you want to get it right. We help communities develop, or we take their existing, say 25% or 50% design plans, and we go out there and we test those geometries and the features of those projects, and let's see how it performs in the real world, and then allows our clients and partners to then adjust if they need to, so that when they put things into hardscape and permanent landscaping and dig up utilities and do all that work, there's a level of confidence in it performing well. And that's what you see in these two examples from New Britain, Connecticut, in their downtown. That's Arch Street on the left, which is just an offshoot of their main street. And then in Asheville, same sort of situation on Cox Avenue in their downtown. Both of these are going into construction, by the way, now. A similar example in Hudson, New York, we were involved on the front end of a process through a DRI grant. So we worked with a great landscape architecture firm called Arterial, which is based over in New Jersey. We worked with the community to sort of pilot test a number of treatments that the DRI grant could then permanently fund. And what you see here is Warren Street, which, if you know Hudson, is their incredible main street. And at the end of it, there's a wonderful park that also got reinvested in as part of the DRI grant. And so we were showing how the pedestrian enhancements could work geometrically in the short term as sort of an interim play. And then you see there on the right, this was recently, Arterial sent me these photos of the permanent constructed project, which came 4 years later. If you want to get technical, you can test out materiality. Back in 2016, 17, we worked with 3 different communities in Northwest Arkansas on their main streets. And what they were trying to achieve was connecting these downtowns and main streets to this incredible greenway system that they've built, which is the Razorback Greenway. And they want to scale up more bike infrastructure investments. But at the regional level and the local level, there's a lot of questions about, what is the best materials? What are the maintenance implications? How does it perform? And so we did a pilot project in each of these 3 communities to look at different ways that sort of quick build or tactical interim material sets could be used to deliver those changes long before permanent investment could be made, and to better connect people from main streets and the trails themselves. Number 5, we saw all of this during the pandemic. Obviously, this is an artist in downtown Toronto, showcasing that when we needed to have more space, that space was not available. So this is this artist put a 6-foot radius around himself as a circle to kind of prove the point that if we're going to be able to move around our communities at a time of crisis, we're going to need more space for people, which means taking space from vehicles. And so it was a really, I think, interesting piece of performance art that spoke to the way our streets are designed, that oftentimes not adequately designed for people, particularly in our downtowns. And as many know, what came next was sort of this, response to all these different needs at different levels of main streets, neighborhood streets, urban, suburban, rural environments. All these communities started to adapt and experiment. And lo and behold, a lot of those experiments have held. Here's an example of working with Bronxville, New York on their emergency outdoor dining program, which was primarily composed of tents and concrete blocks and AstroTurf. And as the pandemic wore on and those materials sort of started to fade and not look so great, the community really wanted to keep the dining, but they didn't like the aesthetics of the really temporary work that was put out there during the emergency. And so we were able to develop standards for them to make sure that the dining could stay, but it would be a lot more attractive and be in keeping with the context of their lovely downtown. So on the bottom there, you see a few of the images from this summer that followed that guidance, where they built out wooden decks. They have nice steel bollards. You can see there in black on the lower right. And so just bring a better look and feel to the dining, again, to be in keeping with the context. With public spaces, this is kind of building off of the pandemic. We saw a lot of need with clients to bring vitality back, particularly to districts that were over-reliant on tourism. And so this is the Fisherman Wharf area in San Francisco. And what they experienced during the pandemic was a lot more illegal vending crept into these spaces. That the tourism was almost down to zero, and a lot more antisocial and negative behavior was starting to be documented around this, further keeping people away from the district once people were starting to go back to leading more normal lives as the pandemic receded. And so what this project was is a partnership with the CBD, which is their version of a business improvement district. So the Fisherman Wharf CBD, and then the Port, which is a major landowner and partner along the waterfront in San Francisco, to create a very different look and feel along the promenade in Fisherman's Wharf on the waterfront. And so you can see here sort of the vision renderings and then exactly what we got fabricated and built and installed, which was a series of vendors that could come in and further animate the space, a welcome center with ambassadors, and the series of pergolas, which we created as flexible spaces where sanctioned vending could happen. So these movable tables and chairs can be moved around and out of the pergola space, and then those 10 by 10 tents could pop up, and you could do vending inside of them to just further consolidate where that was happening and to make it more organized and provide that level of flexibility in the public realm for that programming to happen at certain times of day or days of the week. A lot of New York main streets are state roads, and a lot of those roads are very challenging from a pedestrian safety and circulation perspective. I mean, obviously that's an issue dealt with around the country, but I know that to be an issue for a lot of New York main streets. This is not New York, but this is a main street in more suburban Culver City, California, where during the pandemic, they experimented with a lot of lane reductions to allow for more space for walking and for outdoor dining. As the pandemic receded, they wanted to make some of those changes more permanent. And so we worked with them over the course of a few years to take a 5-lane main street in Culver City and make it a 3-lane street, which added protected bike lanes, bus lanes, and almost 35,000 square feet of new pedestrian space. And that was all along about 1.3 miles of this major corridor in the city. I could spend a half an hour just talking about this project alone, but it was both extremely successful from the sort of technical data analysis in terms of no congestion really was further created, a lot more cycling, a lot more bus ridership. All those goals were met, but politically it was a disaster. So if you have questions about that, we can dig into that one, because these projects can be successful technically and then politically more challenging. Number 8, there are still far too many incidents in our communities of traffic violence, of fatal crashes or serious crashes that impact families and lives all around in New York City in this example, but of course around the country. This happened to be in my own neighborhood in Clinton Hill a few years back, where a high-speed chase occurred from the police with someone who was a reckless driver. The driver drove the wrong way down a one-way slip lane. jumped the curb and killed a 3-month baby, and severely injured the mother. And this happened all right in front of the daycare where that child, that 3-month-old baby, was about to matriculate. And it was the same daycare where my youngest son went to for 2+ years. And so our community rallied around this, saying this is not acceptable. Our team did a bunch of pro bono work on the front end to help get visuals out in the community and to build political will and support to close off that street, so that could never, ever happen again, and to realize a vision that had been discussed but never acted upon for many years. And so at Gates and Fulton and Vanderbilt, this was turned into a plaza that we informally called Appeline's Garden. That was the name of the baby. And the asphalt art theme there you see in the polka dots is really a theme that was meant to respond to the parents' request on how to honor the baby, which was really to have her be memorialized in community, but also circle time is when we come together as children to learn from others for the first time. It's how we learn to listen, to respect, and be in community. And I think that was really the main idea that the family wanted to express. And that's why you get these various levels of circles. And the children in the community have used this space actively ever since, which is really great to see. And then with what we call site pre-vitalization, if you've got empty lots or large redevelopment sites that are going to take, many years or decades to be built out, activating spaces in the near or midterm can be a very, very strong way to build community and activity and support economic development along the way. And this is a sort of a large scale example in Pittsburgh, which this is the Hazelwood neighborhood where a very large steel mill was decommissioned and demolished. And what was left is 165 acres of land adjacent to downtown Pittsburgh in a neighborhood that over the years was very disinvested in. And so this project became about, first and foremost, bringing the neighborhood adjacent to the site onto the site so that they felt ownership and inclusion before this long-term project is built out. And so for the last 5 years, we've been programming it with many active events and initiatives to bring public life to this site, as slowly these development parcels around the green, which was built first, go vertical. And so now this image in the upper left is out of date, but there's a number of mixed-use projects, apartments and research facilities being built out by a master developer. And all this work was seeded by a partnership between a few different foundations and Carnegie Mellon as a sort of key research partner that's occupying a lot of that lab space. So it's a very unique sort of situation in development, but I think the principles of bringing programming and life to vacant spaces obviously has relevance to our communities of all sizes. And finally, if you're going to do this work and do it repeatedly, oftentimes, at a city level, at a municipal level, you need policy, you need material guidance, you need to sort of help standardize the practice so that you're not reinventing the wheel and not every project is a one-off. And so we've helped lots of places do that over the years so that there's a practice built that, we don't just come to town, do one project and leave, but that the methodology can be memorialized and then look to be applied when it's appropriate, which is not always appropriate, but when it is, to help communities with these types of approaches. And I'll just call out here in blue something we're just finishing up now, which is a materials guide for quick build projects or tactical projects across the state of Connecticut, which is really in response to their state DOT has a directive that now allows local communities to do quick build tactical projects on state roads. And as far as I know, that might be the first of its kind in the country. And the point of this guide was really to help communities understand how to do those projects and what materials do I use, because the DOT's guidance offers nothing of information for that. And so we've built that out with a partner to be a resource for state roads more specifically. So I think in the interest of time, I'm going to move through this pretty quickly so we have at least 15 minutes for conversation. But I want to share a couple a couple more in-depth studies of this work. This is a project that's very much still active. It's going into the next phase, which is called North Coast Yard. If you can see on the right there in the background, that's the Cleveland Browns Stadium. This is a waterfront site that's in the heart of the city that is also bordered by the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and a science museum, and is cut off by a highway. And so this space has been asphalt right on the lake for way too long. And so they developed a long-term vision and did a really extensive community outreach process as part of that master planning to look at scenarios where this site gets redeveloped, both with vertical development, keeping the stadium or the stadium leaving, but overall transforming this completely into a park and public space that would be used and accessible by all Clevelanders. So this is their long-term vision. This is going to be hundreds of millions of dollars over decades to build out. So they wanted to get started right away. So there's 25 acres of land here, and it's quite well used for a Cleveland Browns football game, which, by the way, now they're leaving for the suburbs. So this is not going to be well used moving forward. But it had no amenities, no power, no water, no restroom infrastructure. It was just broken asphalt and concrete. And yet you would see people out there using this, walking, jogging, getting access to the lake, but clearly it was not designed for that. And so the goal of this project was to, in the near term, create a gathering space that was inspired by the long-term plan and start to get some of those uses that are envisioned in that plan actually being used by people in the short term. And so this was a partnership with the city of Cleveland, who threw in $1 million of seed funding. They chartered a new development corporation called the North Coast Development Corporation. And then we worked with two great local partners in Tom Strinsky and David Yurka at Seventh Hill to be our local partners to then carry forward all the construction, design, programming, and activation of this space this past summer. We started with an event prototype last fall. We just wanted to prove out, would people come here if we did something fun? Like, would they show up for a movie, with different activities? And the response was overwhelmingly yes. There's a huge hunger to be on this site. And so from December 2024 through June of 2025, we were able to go from concept to permitting to construction to programming by the middle of June. And so the site plan allowed for a lot of flexibility, a lot of programming as well, both active sports programming, as you would see in a park, but also cultural programming. We have a bar, we have stages, we have sort of a plaza area, and then the blacktop gets used for all sorts of things like soccer, basketball leagues come and play here, skating, biking. It's really quite well used. And we kind of came up with a series of components and materials that would be low cost but durable, given the fact that this site has a lot of weather, a lot of wind, a lot of exposure. And so it had to be, flexible in terms of it to move some of these things around from time to time, but it had to be, in place and sturdy for the conditions. And so here was sort of the initial build plan of what we wanted to get done. We worked with, dozens and dozens and dozens of partners to come out and build furniture, to paint, to install the project. And this is what it looks like when it's being well used. So you see the main entrance there on the lower left, and then you can kind of see the different activities and elements that are part of this this project, which, after a successful first season of programming, we're now going to be expanding the site, expanding the programming, and building this out further while they keep pursuing the master plan development. So we've had more than 70 program partners, coming from all different types of neighborhoods in Cleveland, had more than 20,000 attendees from June to September. And it really did prove out the demand, and the investment is worth making in this interim activity, all while the long-term work continues apace. And then finally, in my last few minutes here, I'll talk about Back to New York, Broadway Vision, and the 14th Street Promenade project, which sort of links together this new axes of public space that's in various forms of iteration and delivery. this goes back to 1969 when Regional Plan Association looked at Midtown Manhattan and developed an idea that Broadway should be a pedestrianized street. I think we're all pretty familiar with what's happened, but as you see in the image on the right, that's 1969, that's Broadway, not a great space for people. And while there was this long-term vision, the reality was more or less what you see on the right there for 40 years until the DOT and the Business Improvement District in Times Square Alliance threw out the lawn chairs, which is a very famous image now for urban planners and designers, but it was so cheap and cheerful and effective at proving the demand for the space. But then you see on the upper right how that got made more interim once the demonstration was successful. And then 5 years later in construction and permanent delivery. And so that project, along with some other work on the corridor, really informed this larger vision plan that is not exactly, but very close to what RPA envisioned all the way back in 1969. So it took breaking through the logjam of process and bureaucracy with lawn chairs to get this to start to move forward. And so you can kind of see, how, well, I should say going further south as this vision has moved up and down the corridor, you can see what this looked like in the Flatiron District on Broadway in 2019, so just south of Times Square. During COVID, open streets as a tactic sort of emerged as a way to get outdoor dining to happen, to get more public space. But you can see this is pretty uninspiring. So we worked with the bid in Flatiron and Nomad to create a 2-block plaza to make it look and feel much more like a public space, much more open to people. And that's what that looks like now, the same block. So it's gone from, I would call this sort of like the demo to the pilot to the interim design, using the city's standard, quick build street improvement toolkit. And it's been overwhelmingly successful on not only these 2 blocks, but this project has sort of gone north to Herald Square. It's gone south all the way down to Union Square, which I'll show you in a minute. And just to underscore the point of why do we test things, because when you change the city, behavior changes. And so these 2 blocks really, because they were car-free, changed the pattern of traffic, not only for people driving, but it also inspired much more cycling to be going contraflow. So now you had almost 20% of cycling behavior going northbound against the southbound flow, which is what it was before the pandemic. And so by observing those big changes, the city and the bid were able to rethink in that interim design condition how it should allow for that 2-way cycling to happen along the corridor, given that desire line. So that pilot project was able to prove that out, and the interim design took that lesson and embedded that lesson into the redesign of the corridor. And so from 2020 with 35% vacancy, 3 years later, that was 0. By 2021, the footfall on these 2 blocks had surpassed 2019 numbers. They were documenting how long people were staying, which was longer and later than other areas within the district. And then over time, the cycling movements increased to 28%. So about a third are northbound movements along the corridor. And this, as you move along Broadway, you see how this is all starting to work. And as you get to Union Square, they have this really amazing long-term vision for how the square basically expands out to all of its edges. But again, $100 million plus project. It's not happening overnight. And so as the Broadway Vision Project has moved its way south to touch the square, and the busway along 14th Street on the south side of the square has thinned out traffic pretty dramatically, the bid in Union Square found the opportunity to do a lot more testing. And so we've worked with them for 5 years now and a series of different artists to bring this pilot project every year as a way to keep that vision moving forward. And I'll come back to that in a second. And on the other end of the 14th Street, so on the intersecting corridor of 14th Street with Broadway, there's a vision plan for the district. And to get that project in the ground, we were working with the bid there to create a materials catalog for tactical projects, but that is appropriate for a historic district, which is what the meatpacking district largely is. And so we studied the materiality. We looked at the things we could do tactically and in interim design to sort of bring that look and feel of the district, but using that flexibility, because sometimes tactical materials are criticized for being ugly, for not being durable. And so we wanted to find solutions to that as part of this effort. and then test it and deliver it on some projects that were in their Western Gateway Vision Plan. So here you see a plaza that was installed in 2023, how it's used now with a new crosswalk over the West Side Highway to a series of parks that just got built. This plaza has evolved. It's had art programming and events. And by bearing out the tactical toolkit with that one project, we decided to take a bigger bite at the apple, which was this 14th Street transformation, which is a very wide street and not a lot of traffic given congestion pricing, given the busway. And so there's an opportunity to reclaim a vast majority of the street space. So we envisioned what that could be, worked with the community, looked at this technically on where different public space platforms could be created, which delivered about 15,000 square feet of new space. And that's what this looks like now. And these decks are connected by large granite blocks, planters, and trees that extend the sidewalk space up to 18 feet on either side of the street, and still allows for pickup, drop off, delivery, etc. So here you see some more imagery of how that space is used now. And I think to the big point of tactical urbanism, all this work in Union Square, the Meatpacking District, has inspired this new investment to do a technical design study to make a lot of these transformations permanent. And that, again, is the whole point. And so I'll end with this. I said if we can get people to hug, kiss, socialize, and be comfortable doing that activity in the street, we'll know we've been successful. And this is from a picture shortly after that opened in the Meatpacking District, like showing that we're achieving our goals in the interim and bringing a lot of benefit while we wait for long-term transformation to happen. So thank you. That was a lot from me, but I'm happy to answer questions. And even if we have to go over time a little bit, I've got a little flexibility in my schedule too. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Mike. I have to say, Robert and I have been practicing Main Street revitalization, downtown revitalization, urban design for 40 years. I don't make us sound old, but seeing that presentation and the great work that Mike Lydon and Street Plans are doing has me sort of excited and motivated to do more and do better, because that is really outstanding work. We all know, about the ideas behind this work, but to see how, Mike, you were able to sort of connect it to the work we do on downtowns and main streets is inspiring. So thank you very much for that. We do have at least, about 15 minutes, and we have a nice tight group of about 20 plus participants. And so that's easy. I don't have to have you type in your questions. You can just raise a hand and ask, and we can have a nice discussion amongst the 20 of us.
Yeah, Victor, maybe we can ask if people are going to ask a question they put on their camera.
Yes.
Yeah. So just to get things going, I'd like to ask a question. There's obviously you've talked about, and we know there's a lot of resistance to progressive ideas, right? We see doing things that have never been done before, or maybe they were done a long time ago and forgotten about. Are you starting to see that it's getting easier to sort of roll that giant boulder up the hill? You find that there's some momentum now, and we're starting getting to a point where, there's not as much resistance to doing creative things?
I mean, I think especially professionally, it's night and day from, let's say, 2013 or 14. I mean, we were trying to sell this idea for 3 or 4 years before we even saw an RFP from an organization, a city asking for it. And to go against the stream of engineering and street design, as you all know, is very challenging. And that was still our biggest fight, even 8 or 9, 10 years ago. Now it's slow but steady. We've seen that. I think COVID really helped with this. It's a lot easier, and more places we go, we're being asked to do this work specifically, so that there's already a built-in sort of, if not full approval, there's an understanding from different partners in the city that this is okay. This is like a way to approach change. And so we've seen the adoption of it be very widespread and more heartening. But that's not to say that we don't have our challenges at the local level for whatever reason. And so, not every project is 100% success. I spoke about Culver City briefly. I think I've learned a lot about the timing of projects and what the projects include based on political cycles and how to try to avoid being caught between political cycles and things like that. So there's a lot of nuance in that work, I think, now that we understand where we can expect pushback, but we also have ways that we honestly adjust the projects and make tweaks and changes to be responsive to people when they say they don't like certain things about it. And when people see that responsiveness, I think it goes a long way in building trust. Where they may not fully agree with it, but they see you listened and you responded, and you can do that with a temporary project. You can't do that necessarily with permanent streetscapes.
Yeah, those are good points. I know you can see the plaza behind me on my virtual background here. Was a DOT plaza program in New York City that we brought to Douglaston, Queens. And it was important that we said this was a quote unquote temporary installation to see how it would work. That was a lot easier sell than trying to do a top down, we are implementing this. And it has been hugely successful. And Mike, I was going to ask a question. It's like, how often are your temporary, sort of first step installations and design ideas, how often are they removed? Because I would say, I can't think of any personally, but obviously you know better than I.
Well, there's those that get removed because it's always been planned to be removed, right? Because the
Right.
next thing's coming. So there's a lot of that where we're filling gaps with projects.
Yeah.
But I would say a very small percentage. It has happened, but it's a very small percentage. It's more frequent that something might get adjusted or, even,
Correct.
if we put it this way, watered down a little bit. But like even in the Culver City example, they didn't completely remove everything. They just they combined the bus and bike lane to get a travel lane back. So not great for the cyclists, but also not a full removal of the project. So like even in that case, which was challenging, it wasn't like the whole thing went away.
Right.
And so it's still a placeholder.
It's kind of the part of the process. I mean, here, our next step on this particular one, just as an example, is, turn it into a capital project where we would make the plaza, which is what happened, for instance, in Times Square. It went from a temporary plaza to a capital project. And that's sort of the next step. And it can be adjusted at that point also.
That's right.
Great. All right. Other questions, comments, discussion? We got a nice group here. Just if you mind.
This is Jay.
Jay, how are you? Go ahead, Jay.
I had a question for you about the role that that art and graphic design and kind of visual design plays in this whole process. Could you comment on that?
Yeah. We've found that when we were starting projects, that bringing the aesthetic of art brought a lot more joy and acceptance in communities to the project. So if you're only looking at, striping and signage and bollards, it has an aesthetic that people don't look at it and say, wow, this is beautiful, or wow, this is more space for me, or, stop and admire something. But when the art is introduced, it's almost like they forget about the geometry. They're just happy to have like that splash of color, the theme. And so it's been very powerful as a tool to get people inspired about these projects. We do a lot of the art design in-house, and we do a lot of it in partnership or in collaboration with local artists. And when we find, like, we're happy to do it, but when we do it with local artists, they have their own networks, communities, people that they bring to projects that we never would do ourselves or couldn't do ourselves, right? And so it adds a value and a layer of engagement that's also very powerful. And because we work all over, once we're gone, to have people who are rooted in a place who delivered that project there to advocate for it and feel ownership over it, whether they are just a volunteer helping to paint it or they are the artist or the artist team, is a sort of, secret sauce of getting a lot of this stuff to be accepted over the midterm and to be allowed to then transform into permanence. And sometimes we get our projects go to permanent streetscape, and there's a sense of loss that art is no longer there, actually. So, that can be a dynamic that you have to navigate, because sometimes people like the art more than gray pavers or, the more permanent look.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's not just it's not just the art and having artists come and do it. It's people in the community coming and being creative that gives them ownership of the place.
Right. And I had to fast forward really quick through Union Square, but in year one of that project, 2020, I guess it was, we had a bunch of volunteers. It was great. It was good. But by 2022, 3, 4, like there's a wait list every year annually to sign up to participate. We have corporate partners at Con Ed or at the W Hotel who just are chomping at the bit to get a chance, as their colleague did last year, to also participate. So it's become this bigger event that the neighborhood expects. And so I think, hopefully that will be a long-term lasting transformation in the next decade, but there will be a sense of, oh, we no longer participate in the creation of space together on an annual basis. That will be a bit of a loss.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, on the heels of that, I'd like to jump in and ask. So Jay is head of the Preservation League of New York State, and we all know, right, Elise has been very involved in historic preservation for her whole career. Victor and I have, done over 1,000 buildings around New York State to preserve them on main streets. How important, I know you've touched on it, but how can you elaborate more on the part that historic preservation plays and not just with plaques and things acknowledging, historic sites and buildings, but, when I sit on one of those captured parking spaces, all of a sudden I have a totally different view, right, of the buildings that I'm in front of, and often when you're walking right up against it, you only see 10, 12 feet, right? So is that something that you could elaborate a little bit more on?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I think the Nomad Flatiron project, the blue plaza I showed you, you might not have picked up on it, but we took a detail off of the Flatiron building itself, and that was our stencil pattern on the ground. And we wanted people to connect where they were to the building that terminates the view as you look south. And now that you're no longer squeezed on the sidewalk, you can sit in the street and have a meal, or you can sit and have a meeting, or you can take a phone call, or you could just hang out and look at this building. And now it's been under scaffolding for like 5 years, but soon when that scaffolding comes down, you're just gonna have this glorious view of this iconic building. And so that we connected the temporary project, which lasted for months, but we made that connection to the history of the building in the neighborhood and the namesake for the neighborhood. And that was like a really important thing that I think were able to deliver in the short term. Materially, I really understand the hesitancy to put cheap and cheerful stuff in the street if there's a strong aesthetic and a historic district designation. In fact, that becomes challenging to do the cheap and cheerful in those places. And the meatpacking project was the first time I think we had a chance to fully flex ourselves into figuring out what do you use in a context like that, that is of the ethic of tactical urbanism, but maybe not of the perceived aesthetic. And so that was a really good design exercise to come up with that palette of materials. And it had to go to preservation, it had to go to LPC and get sign off that we could do this, because it's not temporary in the sense that it's going to be there for a year. It's going to be there for probably 15 or more years. So it's really interim. And so that was a consideration in terms of the durability, the aesthetic of it. And at the end of the day, we often use paint. We can use paint to create connection to history, to bring symbology into the murals, for example, that speak to culture or the history of a district, like we did in the Flatiron. But we couldn't do that in 14th Street. It's all, cobblestone, historic cobblestone street. You can't paint that. We didn't want to paint that. And so what we came up with was not just the decks, but those granite blocks that are so ubiquitous now in plaza projects and pedestrian spaces in the city are basically oversized cobblestones. And so that's the kind of approach we took in selling it to LPC and in the district was we're going to use these granite, sort of organic, not the perfectly cut blocks, but the more organic ones, and place those every 8 feet to safely define the pedestrian space, but have it look like the meatpacking district. So that was one of our sort of techniques there on the material selection.
Yeah, because well-designed architecture, whether it's historic or not, is speaking the same language as everything you talked about today to the people that are being affected and using it, right, or just walking by it. So I just want to also quickly say that my wife, Mary Alice Lee, works for the Trust for Public Land, runs a New York City playgrounds program. They've done over 240 playgrounds, taking things that look like prison yards outside of public schools in New York City and turning them into these oases that are now really parks instead of just whatever, a yard. And they follow a lot of the same things that you've been talking about. I think your influence is much broader than you might be aware, but they within these environments, there are all of these tactical pieces, that really make a huge difference. A lot of these are in the poorest neighborhoods in New York, in the toughest crime-ridden places, and all of a sudden they have this place that have what you're talking about as part of the fabric of the playground.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and that's another use case, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I gave you 10 applications kind of on the street side of things, but our next book is exploring like 25 different ways this has been applied, not all by us, but by others as well. Because there's if you take the methodology and the mindset, you could
building to the 12-foot fence that
Yep.
made up the edge. It was just, that's what Victor and I grew up with, and now thanks to your good work and a lot of others, they have a totally different place to grow up in, right? So
right. Yep. And my kids benefit from that now.
That's it. All right, we have time for just a few more questions. It is 10:02 a.m. Mike is generous to stay for another couple of minutes, and this talk will be followed almost immediately by the New York Main Street Alliance fall board meeting that Robert will chair. Any other comments, questions, discussion? I see Steve and Elise, so Steve, we'll start with you. Elise will call on you next. Steve, go ahead.
All right. I missed the beginning, Mike, but we need about 10 hours to go through some of the stuff. But I'll ask one specific question. I look at things differently from South Brooklyn and traveling around. I'm the acting president of the Small Business Congress. Small businesses have a little different viewpoint than people who live in the neighborhood and want to hang out and drink a coffee and play and look at their cell phones. They want access to their right in the front of their store. Many of them are concerned about vehicle access being lost and how it's impacted them, and adding the cost to have other vehicles and ways to get it there. And as you know, small businesses surviving in New York City is difficult. We're still losing about 22 to 2,600 mom and pop stores every month. They close. Nobody hears about it. You hear about the neighborhood store that everybody loved that was there 80 years, but you don't hear about all the others struggling. And what I wonder is, have you ever been active in changing a bike lane, moving it somewhere else, as opposed to, like you gave an example of combining a bike and a bus lane? In my neighborhood, we had 8 organizations work for 6 years for a bike lane. We were given A or B choices, A and B, and it was unanimous, which everyone here in this panel knows that never happens in New York, unanimous. I've never seen it in 40 years. But we all agreed on Plan B, and during COVID, because a lot of this stuff happened during COVID when people were asleep for a few years, they shoved the bike lane in on A, which the whole community is now in an uproar about because it's impacted senior citizens' homes, bait and tackle shops, waterfront uses, 6 different marinas. We've had an increase in accidents, people being hurt, and there's nobody listening. Nobody's against the bike lane. We simply had 2 choices where to put it. We all agreed on a different street. And so I wonder if you ever have been involved in getting something changed like that, as opposed to just tweaking it, but actually moving it to where the community wants it.
I don't think that we have, in terms of taking an existing, link in the network and moving that over. I guess the only way to comment on that is I don't see a lot of willingness to do like a one-day plaza or event-based ways of introducing ideas with communities in New York from certain units of the Department of Transportation. The bike unit, I've seen a little bit less willing to say, let's go and actually pilot this or demonstrate this for a weekend, a month, to like show it, because what that allows you to do is you can, if it goes on A, it gives you all the reasons and point to, you can capture it and say, look, see, this is why it's not working on A, we want it on B. Or it goes to B, like, see, this is actually really working for all of us, and the concerns we have with A are not coming to fruition because now it's on B. And that sort of half step, that dip your toe in the water test, and not over committing to, an interim project that's going to be there for a long, long time, I think is important when there's skepticism or desire to do that A/B testing, right? We have done quite a bit of A/B testing where we've done two different, in fact, with bike lanes, we've done a test in a California community where there were three options and we tested two of them and said, which one do you guys like better? And what allowed for that was there was a median in the street, on the main street. And so on one side of the median, we had a buffered bike lane, and the other side we had a more parking protected bike lane. And so you could literally see the difference on the same blocks. And then the community could then vote and say, this is the configuration that we want. So a little more experimentation with that, or just openness to test bikeways, might help the department, and then communities kind of resolve and come to a better longer term solution. But I haven't seen a whole lot of that here in the city.
Yeah, that's the problem. That's why I mentioned it, because we have now an uproar and businesses closing, and most of the guys from the New York Main Street Alliance know I live in Sheepshead Bay on the waterfront, and it's drastically hurt all the businesses. A lot of them closed. We had 44 boats, then 33, 38. We're down to 6. One bait and tackle shop part-time. And the marinas and the yacht clubs are struggling because the bike lane has interfered with access, parking, boat loading in and out, to the point where people are just up in arms.
Sorry to hear that.
They're giving up. They feel like there's nothing they can do. And they've complained, and they've called, and we met with DOT, and DOT said, no, we know best. We've had community meetings with them. And when you got the entire community on one side and nobody on the side of DOT, and they're telling you in the community they know better, it's difficult. That's why I wondered if you ever been involved in that.
So, Steve, why don't you hire Mike to be your consultant?
Yeah, we got no money, but we would love your help.
Well, because no, that's a very good point, because that's the resistance, right? The negative to some of the good work Mike's done, we've done, others have done, is exactly that. It's like, that we don't want it that way. Are you listening to us? This is more of a political and government implementation thing, and it is real. What the issue that Steve is raising is real, and he's dealing with it in Brooklyn. But it is a political issue. The work that Mike is proposing that we've tried to do is trying to make improvements and listening and working with the community. And the powers that be, I have found the same thing. I found really good people, city government, really good people, DOT, and then I've seen where they have been inflexible. And just like the work we're trying to do, the inflexibility is never successful because it just isn't, in my opinion. So we need to work at that level of sort of political engagement. All right, Elise, you had your hand up, and then we may have to wrap up because it's 10:09. But I know you had your hand up next, Elise.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. Mike, when you mentioned your next book, what's it called and when will it be out?
Nothing is final on either of those questions. Right now, we're calling it Tactical Urbanism: 25 Ways to Transform Your Community. So it's largely, if the first book was what is this idea, this next book is about how to actually apply it in lots of different situations. So that's the crux of it. And I am hoping it comes out in the fall of 2026. We are working hard. It was a lot easier to write the first book. We were a lot less busy, but we're working hard to try and wrap it up by end of the year. So that way it could publish in the fall. But yeah, stay tuned. Thanks.
Everyone has the first book. It's a classic. It's why Mike is one of the 100 most influential urbanists of all time. It has influenced all of our work and so many of our cities. Mike, this is the part of the talk show host where you sell your book. That's why you came onto the talk show.
Oh, I don't like to sell my
You
book.
got to be selling the book. Always be selling. Always
Well,
be
that was
closing.
great. That was a
That's right.
great talk, and we really appreciate your time. And hopefully we'll get you to come back when your new book is out and give a talk
Yes.
about that.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Let me
Thanks,
mention
guys.
it, as I always do, besides a big thank you to Mike Lydon and all the great work he's doing, and for preparing this presentation, spending time with New York Main Street Alliance. His presentation is 101 slides, and there's a lot of detail and a lot of good work in there. Mike has generously offered to share that with everyone. So please shoot us an email, nymainstreetalliance@gmail.com, if you'd like a copy of that presentation as a PDF. There's so much good information in there that it's almost like another book, a 100-page book. that we can share with you if you just contact us, and we'll be happy to do that. All righty. So thank you, Mike. Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks all.
And we
Thanks for
will
taking the
keep in
time.
touch.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
I'm going to stop recording.